The original Bucky Lou is Chris Boucher's third book. He first learned of Lou as he was looking into his own family history in their shared neighborhood of Pawtucketville in Lowell, where Lou started as a pro. Despite being a lifelong basketball fan, he had never heard of the man who single-handedly integrated the sport, and when he learned why, Lou had no full-length biography, he set out to write it. And this is our program tonight. Take it away, Chris.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thanks for your patience tonight too. So yes, I'm Chris Boucher. I'm going to talk about my book, The Original Bucky Lou, Basketball's First Black Professional. I'll talk about early basketball as well as Hudson's kind of connection to that. So who is Bucky Lou? So this is Bucky Lou. This is an 18-year-old hotshot out of Lowell YMCA. On the evening that we'll focus on to begin with, it's potentially a historic night because he has signed to play as a substitute for a team in the New England Basketball League. The game is in Marlborough, Mass. He's come down with a Lowell team. He's only signed to play as a sub. He has not signed a full season's contract. However, if he does get in the game, this will be historic because it would be the first integrated game in pro basketball. Now, of course, there is the local connection too, which is why we're here in Hudson. They also had a team in that league and actually went much further back than that as well. So this is a picture of Jack Porter, who was an early basketball star. In fact, he led his team in 1898 to the first championship of the New England League, which was then a little smaller and called the Massachusetts League. According to the Pro Basketball Encyclopedia, in the first 5 years of the game, he was both the best offensive and defensive players. Now, you can't read this caption. It's difficult for me to read as well, but I'll just give you a little hint of what's here. So this is from 1901. This is a basketball game where Hudson faced Webster. Unfortunately, Hudson lost, but it was a close game. But Jack Porter was part of that game. He was the designated free throw shooter. So he, in that game, was the top scorer. The final score was, 21-18, Webster won. Jack Porter made 8 of 9 free tries to lead the team with 8 points. Now,
He played for Hudson?
He played for Hudson, yes. Right here is in a South Framingham uniform. These guys bounced around a lot. But yes, he played for Hudson that night. Made 8 of 9 free throws. That would be good today. That was amazing for back then. Because if you could read this caption, you would see that the designated free throw shooter for the other team was 1 of 8. So I don't know, was that 15%? So we have someone shooting 85% versus something like 15%. Pretty remarkable. And even though Porter didn't have any field goals in that game, he did lead his team in scoring. So that's what that is. And Porter actually played with Lou in 1903 as well. We'll talk about that a little more later. So any other connections to Hudson? So actually Hudson was in a good spot for early pro basketball because of the railroads. And I'm not sure if you're aware of it. People are often surprised when I do these talks about how good the railroads were in those days. They're actually much better than they are today. There are more trains, more connections, longer times. So in this railroad map that I've displayed, you can see Hudson's got a spot on it, and basically this would provide you access to half a dozen cities where games were being held. So even though you might be in a small, out-of-the-way town, because of the convenient rail access, you could get to games all over the place if you wanted to. So now let's talk a little bit more about the game then before we get back to Bucky Lou's first night. So there were some similarities and there were some differences. So you had a basketball, you had a basket. The goal was to put the ball in the basket, right? So that's a similarity. Some differences were the ball was entirely different. So it was a little bit bigger. It also had laces, as you can see, kind of like a football does today. The reason for that was they had to open it up to put air in the bladder, then they would close it back up and they would play with it. But the problem with that was the ball wasn't a pure sphere when they were done with that. The players of the day described it as a lumpy pumpkin. So it made it much more difficult to dribble, pass, or shoot. So similar to baseball of that day, which is referred to as the dead ball era, basically because of the equipment, kind of substandard equipment, didn't didn't start out very well and just got worse as the game went along. The basketball was a similar challenge to the players, so we can consider it the dead ball era of basketball too, and it's one of the reasons that the scores in those days were much lower. The hoop's a little different too. It was smaller. In this league, there were no backboards, so it was much more difficult to shoot. Courts were smaller. It was much more difficult to get open. They actually had a cage that surrounded the court. There was no out of bounds. The games just kept going. All right, what were some other characteristics of the game of the day? Well, one was segregation. You had black teams, you had white teams, you did not have mixed teams. Way back then, these different teams didn't play each other either. So that was one characteristic. What was another one? Violence. So it was a very violent sport. So on this slide, I do have a quote from a newspaper reporter of the day who was just seeing his first basketball game. And he described it as combining all the exciting elements of boxing, wrestling, football, murder, and a house on fire. So it was a good time. So you had rough players and you had rowdy fans. So a couple of the captions that I'm displaying here, I could talk about a little bit. The one on your left reads, 2 teeth gone from tie set. So there was an instance in the game where 2 players were fighting over a loose ball. One player ripped the ball away from the other one whose hands were not free, used them to pummel the other player, knocked his teeth out, knocked him unconscious. That was not actually uncommon for the game of the day. Fist fights were very common. The other caption we have talks about how a referee was nearly bogged by 300 fans after the game because they were unhappy with his decision making. And further, the way the story is told, it's clear that the newspaper reporter is siding with the fans and not the referee. So you had a lot of homers in the press as well. What else? Gambling. So gambling was illegal in those days, but it was encouraged by both the promoters, the players themselves, and the newspapers, because they thought it added interest to the game. Now, interestingly, it may actually have helped Lou that night, and we can talk a little bit more about that in a second. But before I get there, so I've talked for a few minutes so far. Any questions or thoughts or observations as I get a drink? How many teams? Usually about 8 in the New England League. So teams kind of came and went. So the league sometimes shrank, sometimes expanded, but typically had about 8 teams.
And do you happen to know where in Hudson games were played?
Yes, the old Opera House, which I understand burned down a long time ago. But that's where Hudson played. The capacity was 750 people.
Wow.
So that was their home court.
What
And I have a
about-
picture of that you've probably all seen, but we'll look at that later.
Modern fouls like traveling and what was the game like? Was it just free for all?
So it was very physical. You could double dribble, so that was a little different. It was hard to shoot, basically. So the primary challenge that players in that day had, and part of it was that the game was new.
How high
They were
was
still
it?
trying to figure it out.
Was it 10 feet?
It was 10 feet, yeah.
Okay.
It was basically basketball. It was lopsided, and they were still learning to shoot. They would do their free throws. They shot what we would call a diaper shot when I was a kid, kind of like that, which actually is a good way to shoot your free throws. When Wilt Chamberlain shot that way, that's when he scored 100 points that one game. But that was one way. Then they did like a set shot instead of a jump shot. So you can imagine that it was difficult to get off a clean shot in a smaller court, much more crowded, and you're shooting from about your waist instead of over your head. All right, so let's get back to Lou's game. So as I said, this is a potentially historic night. Lou is signed as a sub. He's the 6th man. However, when one of his teammates is injured during warm-ups and cannot play and comes off the court, his manager, Jimmy Gray, does not send Lou out. Instead, he wants to play 4-on-5. Now you can imagine this doesn't go over very well with the crowd. Even though the game is in Marlboro, about 50 fans from Lowell have taken a train down to watch it, and they freak out, and according to Lou, this is why he gets in the game, because the fans are so unhappy. So I mentioned the slide or two ago about how gambling was illegal but encouraged. I actually wonder if gambling might have helped Lou get in that game, because the people who had money on the game wanted to see a talented player out there, wanted to see a fair game. Not sure. Not sure what Gray's motivation was, but there's some potential for that. So what does happen? He gets in the game, he plays well. According to the papers, he did appear in the game. One said he played well. No one noted that it was a historic night. Not sure why. Maybe they just weren't tracking things like that back in the day. There was no headline reading first integrated game in pro basketball, but it is a documented fact that he did appear. So what else happened? So since he did play well, he then signed a contract for the season. He joins Lowell's Pawtucketville Athletic Club. He becomes a fan favorite both in Lowell and around New England, and you can see his team there. In Lowell, he plays in Huntington Hall, which no longer stands. If you're familiar with downtown Lowell at all, it's basically across from City Hall. What remains of it are these three arches that are kind of just kitty-cornered away from City Hall. This is kind of interesting because it was set up like North Station in that you had trains underneath, and you can see that in the picture. You have some tunnels for the trains, and up above you had a large hall. So there were no real dedicated basketball arenas in those days that could fill a lot of fans, so they basically played where they could. Whether it was an opera house, an armory, or just a big hall, they would set up their court, bring the fans in, and they would watch the game. So they would get about 2,000 fans at Huntington Hall in Lowell, which was capacity, which is a good crowd for back then. I mean, I was reading recently that in the NBA's first year, when they were calling themselves the BAA, 1946, 8 out of 10 teams averaged about 3,000 in attendance. So 50 years prior in Lowell, they're getting 2,000, so 2/3 of that, so a pretty good crowd. So now the question's been asked and answered. Where did Lou play in Hudson when he came down here to play? And that was the Opera House. And here's a picture of what that looked like quite a while ago. So it did only fit 750, and Hudson's teams kind of came and went. I had mentioned that Jack Porter led his team to a championship in 1898. After that, they kind of slid a little bit as the league grew, and they started to pay players more, and they started to import players from other states. I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect that Hudson couldn't keep pace with the salaries, and so they didn't consistently have a team or consistently have a top team anymore. All right, so back to Bucky Lou. He concludes that first season. He suffers his share of injuries and indignities, as you can imagine. I did mention that it was a rough game. Here's a list of some of the injuries that he suffered through. He was once kicked in the stomach, had to leave the game, hit in the face, it closed his eye, he had to leave the game. Once he gashed his hand in the wire fence that surrounded the court, required stitches. He also dislocated his shoulders throughout his career. One of the things I was happy to do in researching the book was speak to his granddaughter, Wendy Johnson, and she said one of her persistent memories of him later in life was sitting in a chair, his favorite rocking chair, with a tank top on and rubbing his shoulders. So it seems like that was an injury that bothered him throughout his life. He also suffered some indignities as well. He was once called his manager's colored ballet. Crowds tried to shut him off the floor. Team once refused to play him. We can talk more about that in a little bit. And he was once denied lodging in New Hampshire. So that's an interesting story. So he had played a game in Vermont. For whatever reason, they went to New Hampshire after the game to try to catch the train out of town, the next town. Stopped at one place, they would not let the team stay. Tried another, they could not stay there either. Tried to stay overnight at the train station, and the night watchman said that he thought they looked like burglars and would not let them stay there either. So they had to walk 10 miles in the middle of a freezing January night to the next town down the line until they could find a place to stay.
What year was that?
So that would be 1907. That's when he played in Vermont. And it was Charlestown, New
Yeah, they
Hampshire.
used to have that green book that would tell them where they could stay.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
so this precedes the Green Book. So that was basically an automobile era. In 1907, they weren't quite there yet. That's why they're at the
That's
train
what I was
station.
wondering.
That's
Okay.
how they were moving around.
Yeah.
So that's a sad incident that happened, right? One bit of silver lining with that is The team that Lou played against was actually traveling with him, and he actually had just defeated them, but they stayed with him this whole time. So when he couldn't stay, they didn't stay either. So the whole group of them had walked those 10 miles down to the next town to catch the train out of there. So kind of a silver lining to that story. So he certainly had his share of adversity, but he had his allies as well. So despite all that, he becomes known as a clean and skillful player. One player who played with him much later in life said at times the going was rough for him, but he never got ruffled or angry. And he actually became a beloved figure around New England. And I could read you some quotes from the book, from the papers of the day to help kind of reinforce that point. All right, so these are compiled after his first season. One goes, "This man Lou is a wonder. Last year his work in the New England League was the talk of every city in which he appeared." Another, "Lou is known throughout New England among basketball fans as an exceptionally clean as well as a skillful player." Another, "A prominent basketball official says that for all-around playing, Lou is the best in the game." Bucky Lou is an attraction in every city and town where the PAC plays. He's a little chap, but lively on his feet and has a pretty good eye for the basket. Lou possesses the alertness of a cat, and his dodging through the defense of a whole team is pretty to watch. The colored players considered the real goods. My favorite, Lou is a gentle little man to look at, but when the whistle blows, he becomes a whirlwind.
How tall was he? What was his stature?
5'6".
5'6".
Yeah, so he was small even for those days.
5'6", huh?
Time for you to ponder a question. Do you think that was the end of the line for Lou, considering all that we've covered? I'll get a quick drink.
When he played, how much did they get paid per game?
So they had a salary cap, $5 per game, which is about $200 a game. Not big money today, but it was something. So it was not something you would necessarily be able to do year-round as a profession, but it was some nice extra money for most players. And the other out-of-towners who were brought in and paid that would get kind of like their lodging and boarding expenses covered as well, living expenses covered as well. So it was a salary cap, but like, some salary caps, sometimes the teams went over, and oftentimes when the spending get out of control, that's when many of these early leagues, which didn't tend to last very long, would fold. But the official salary cap was $5 per game. And they would play 4 to 5 nights per week from November to March, kind of the traditional basketball season.
I'm sorry, the season was from when?
Basically November to March, similar to today's basketball season. It might be a little longer in like the NBA, but that's basically the cold weather. When football ends, basketball begins.
How much would they charge for admission?
So 25 cents, 35 cents, sometimes up to 50 cents.
So if you were charging 50 cents at the 2,000 seat arena in Lowell, they made $1,000 and probably paid out $100.
So you had to rent the hall, you had to pay the officials and the game scorers and folks like that. But if you got a full crowd, you were doing pretty well. So they tried, yeah.
Well, they probably made money on the side, the beer and popcorn and
And the gambling.
the gambling.
I think the gambling was more of a factor, yeah. I would read about side bets, like they put up $100, $200, up to $500, unbelievably, kind of on their team.
Wow, in those days?
Yeah. So Jimmy Gray was kind of flamboyant. So he had a fur coat, he had a diamond ring, and he would reportedly, Jimmy Gray, so that was the man who managed Bucky Lou. He, according to the papers anyway, would be gambling from $100, $200, up to $500 on these games.
And you didn't share that with Lou?
As far as I know, the players are getting $5 a game. They might have had their own side bets. There's no indication that Bucky Lou was doing any gambling. There were sometimes rumors that some of the players were having side bets. Generally, it was frowned upon. It was more really about the fans, and the owners would get into it too and make these kind of bets with each other for those amounts of money. Sometimes the amounts would shrink. I mean, I saw once that Jimmy Gray had set up a pot of $500 for the winner, and then next thing I read, he put up $100 to the newspaper to be matched by the other team. So The figures might have been a little fanciful at times and perhaps designed to generate headlines, but that's what was said in the papers today in black and white. All right, so was that the end for Lou? No, it wasn't. So after that first season, he wants more. Jimmy Gray moves him along to Haverhill. So Haverhill now is an expansion team. Jimmy Gray loans Bucky Lou to that team. Not sure why he did that. I know it's been hard to see some of these images, but at the first game that Bucky Lou appeared in where his team lost, it was Jimmy Gray's picture that was in a newspaper alongside the story. At the end of the season, when Bucky Lou was recognized as a star player, he became the face of the franchise. So it's possible there was some jealousy there. I'm not sure. Jimmy Gray definitely had his eye on the newspapers and seeking to promote himself and his team. So I wonder if that is part of it. I don't know. But that's okay, because it works out for Bucky Lou. So Haverhill ends up becoming a super team. So their manager is really motivated to have a good team. He imports a lot of players from New York, and they become one of the 2 super teams in the league that year. Now we're in 1905. And this is a picture of the Haverhill team. The tallest gentleman in the back is Ed Wachter. He is in the Hall of Fame. He is one of the few players from that era that has made it to the Hall of Fame.
How tall was he?
6'1".
6'1", okay.
Yeah. In those days, and actually one of the people I talked to researching the book, a former UMass Lowell professor, Jerry O'Connor, whose father Dan played with Bucky Lou, they used to talk about people of that height as if they were 7-footers. Like we say, oh wow, there's a 7-footer on team. They'd be like, wow, they had a 6-footer. So it was definitely a smaller, people were of smaller stature playing basketball in those days. So how does Troy, New York, the players from Troy, New York that have been imported to play for Haverhill get there? Well, the trains. And so here's the train line. So you can see again, the trains are a kind of a continuing theme. That's what allows these teams to travel. It's probably also what restricts these leagues to being regional. So this is a New England league. They're not playing outside of New England. There is a national league, but they're really not national. They're basically greater Philadelphia. So at this point, when people are relying on trains for transportation, you have a series of kind of regional leagues in the U.S. All right, so the other team that's a super team in the New England League is playing in Natick, and their top player is Harry Huff. He's the top scorer of his day. So at this point, teams are averaging about 30 points per game. Harry Huff is averaging himself about 15. So he's a big scorer.
What was his name?
Harry Huff.
H-U-F-F?
H-O-U-G-H. Now, Bucky Lou is well known for his defense against Harry Huff. So the very first few games that Harry Huff played in the New England League back in 1903, the first game he played, he scored 26 points out of his team's 32, which was amazing. The next game, he was matched up with Bucky Lou. Harry Huff scored right off the tap, 10 seconds into the game. It looked like he was on his way to another big night. However, Bucky Lou shut him down, matched him the rest of the way. Huff only finished with 6 points. Lou finished with 4 points. So this is pretty remarkable, and this helped Bucky Lou earn headlines around New England. So Haverhill is set to play Natick early in that season. The fans in Haverhill are fired up. Here they are at Old Town Hall, which of course no longer stands. It burned down a long time ago, but that's where they played. But Natick doesn't want to play Bucky Lou and his teammates. Harry Huff leads the team in a boycott and says while he will take the court, he won't participate in any basketball activities while Lou is on the court. So this becomes quite a dramatic scene. Since Haverhill is at home, their crowd is really fired up and they want to see Lou play. However, Lou asked to sit. Not exactly sure why he did that. It may have been because he thought it was going to get ugly and it was going to become a riot. So he decided to sit that game out and then wait and see what happened after that. And in case you're wondering why Harry Huff might decide not to play Lou, while he said he was from the South and it was against his culture, the newspapers of the day suggested something else. And one from Waterbury, Connecticut said, Huff quit because he was afraid to measure his abilities with the colored boy. Bucky Lou is one of the best backfield players in the country. And the Boston Globe weighed in too, and they said that Lou is credited with being the only able opponent for Harry Huff. So I really don't know if Harry Huff was a racist, and that's why he didn't want to play Lou, or if he was just cynical enough that he thought he could get away with it by just saying that it was against his culture. I'm not sure which one is worse. Both are bad, but it has not been resolved. But what is resolved is that the league decides in an emergency meeting after the game that they are going to stand with Lou. They are not going to have a color line in basketball. They are not going to have a segregated league. They want to remain integrated, and Lou will continue to play. The commissioner told Lou directly that he stands with him. So Huff and his teammates are threatened with expulsion if they pull that again. So the season continues. These are the two best teams. They are now set to face off in the finals. Almost. What happens first is that Jimmy Gray from Lowell, whose team is in third place, somehow arranges to play Natick before Natick and Haverhill can play their championship series. Now, that is not something that would come close to happening today, but in those days, the regular season and the postseason were different. Contracts were looser. For some reason, Jimmy Gray is able to get away with this. And so now Haverhill has to sit and wait a week for Natick to finish their series with Lowell. Now, I had mentioned that most of Haverhill's players are from New York, so they don't want to just sit around for a week and wait on the resolution of that series. They want to play some exhibition games so they can make some money. Now, in one of those exhibition games, guess what happens? Lou dislocates his shoulder. So when we get to the finals, he plays in about 2.5 of 7 games. He is not himself, and Natick is the championship. Natick wins the championship. So that's Harry Huff and his team wins the championship that year. But then it gets even worse. So then Ed Wachter and his other New York teammates go back to New York. They gather up a few more players, and they go on a Midwestern tour. They end up beating the team that beat the team that won the 1904 Olympic trials for basketball in Kansas City. And so they now have the right to call themselves world champions. And I have to wonder if Lou did not dislocate his shoulder in that exhibition game while they were waiting for the Natick team to free itself, if Lou would not have had not only a New England championship, but possibly also a world championship that year. But we'll never know. He truly was hurt. One of the papers after that Natick series concluded said that basically his shoulder wouldn't even stay in place, like he had to take months off.
Did he, during the date, other times, did he have another job?
So great question, yes. So his family had a dry cleaning shop in Lowell, in downtown Lowell. So they ran that, and so he helped with that. He actually did not go to high school. Right after 8th grade, he went to work and learned kind of the family business. So that's his day job. And at night, he's playing basketball, or he's working at the Y and doing things like that. So I wonder how much he actually worked while he was playing basketball, because if you see pictures of him, he must have added 30 pounds of muscle in a couple of years to keep up with the physical nature of the game. So I think it probably worked out for him pretty well that there was a family business, and he probably pitched in extra when he could, and maybe spent a little more time in the gym when he could do that too. But typically the players would have another day job unless they're from out of town, and then their living expenses were covered. All right, so let's see if that's the end of the line for Lou. No, of course not. So he plays in the band. I hadn't mentioned yet that he's a violinist, and the family story goes that he met his future wife while he was playing violin in the band. And they say that she was more impressed with his musical ability than his basketball skills. Then he goes up to Vermont. He wins a Vermont state championship in 1907. He's very popular up there too, despite the incident that he had in New Hampshire. And I know we're getting up against the clock here, but I just want to reinforce how popular he was up in Vermont with a couple of quotes from the Vermont papers. And I'll give you one. So this talks about one game that Lou played up there. Said, with less than half a minute to play and score a tie, Bucky Lou sent the ball squarely through the net, winning for them one of the closest and most exciting games ever seen. Lou was a particular star and the idol of the audience, a wonderful player, fast and resourceful. He scored 16 points, and his blocking and dribbling was the best seen here in many a day. So he was a very popular figure in Vermont as well. Moving right along, how does he get up to Vermont? Railroads. So that mess just shows you the railroad network, northern Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont. A lot of connections, pretty easy to get around. What else? He starts his own independent team. They're known as Lou's Low Five. They travel around. He signs a lot of ethnic players from kind of the textile cities of the area. So during this time, if you know your history, 1915, that's when Birth of a Nation comes out. That's when the Klan kind of revives. During this period, Bucky Lou is traveling around with his team made up of Irish and French Canadian Catholics. He's a black man running a team. He also has Jewish players. So kind of interesting that he's out there in New England doing that in that era when reportedly the Klan has gone up to about 400,000 members. He also runs a team in a revived attempt to do another New England league. Now they're traveling by car, so they throw 6 of them in there and they would try to come down to Hudson or Marlboro or whatever and play a game against the locals. He also coached college in 1903, 1922. Lowell Textile School, which is now UMass Lowell, which is a Division I basketball program. So he's got a bunch of other firsts here. He also partnered with Billy Sullivan Sr., whose son was the founder of the Boston Patriots, who ended up becoming the New England Patriots. Billy Sullivan Sr. was the owner of the biggest hall in Lowell in the 1920s, and he partnered with Lou to fill that hall with games from various places. Lou had a Nashua team, he had a Lowell team. He also tried to revive the New England League in the 1920s as well. He's also the first referee. They started another league as his career was winding down. This is an article that announces the formation of that league. What's interesting is it talks about the president, the treasurer, all these other executives, but there's only one man's picture that accompanies the story, and that's Bucky Lou. So it just shows you the credibility that I had in the area when it comes to basketball. And here's my favorite blurb. He was a true triple threat. So this is a caption from a paper talking about how they're going to have to reschedule a game because Bucky Lou is scheduled to both coach, referee, and play at the same time. So he did it all, and sometimes all in one night. Unfortunately, during the Depression, he left Lowell, moved to Springfield. His wife got very active in charity work down there. This is kind of interesting. He stepped back and allowed his wife to step out and do more in the community, which is something that she had always wanted to do. He died in 1963. He's buried in Springfield, not too far from the Hall of Fame. You might ask, is he in the Hall of Fame? Unfortunately not. While the Hall recognizes his status as the first black professional, they have not inducted him as a member. And we can talk about that more later if anyone has a question about it.
Did he have kids?
Yes, he did. So he had a son and, 3 daughters who survived into adulthood, and then granddaughters and grandchildren. The closest living relative I'm aware of is his granddaughter, who lives in Milton, Massachusetts, and I was able to speak to and research in her book, which is really neat for me. I think he passed when she was about 13 or 14, so she has some pretty solid memories of him. He also influenced greater integration. So if you're aware of it, in 1946, the Dodgers placed the first black players in Nashua, while Jackie Robinson played in Montreal. So the president of the Dodgers had assured Branch Rookie that the city would welcome those players, and you might wonder how he knew that. Well, he knew that because as a high school basketball player, he used to play at halftime of Bucky Lou's pro games up in Nashua. So kind of interesting connection there, which has recently come to light. And this last one is just some of the recent honors that Lou has had in and around Lowell. There is a Lou Family Square. The YMCA has put up a plaque in his honor. At the Songus Arena in Lowell, we have this exhibit, which kind of goes through the milestones of his career. If you're at the Songus Arena watching a basketball or hockey game or some other event, look for it. It's right near the Dippin' Dots. Very convenient location. And then what about Jack Porter? So we talked about him quite a while ago. He died in 1924, so he died in his 40s. He is nearby. I was going to try to go see him on the way here, but didn't have time to do it. Forestvale Cemetery, which I guess is just a couple miles that way. So he's in there, and that's a stone. He was married, didn't have any children.
But he graduated from Hudson High School.
Did he?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. His obituary is available. I don't know, did you look him up at Find a Grave or any of that stuff?
I got actually on Wikipedia.
Okay, okay.
He's got a little blurb.
Okay, actually, oh, nice, all right, I didn't know he was in there, okay, cool. Yeah, he was an early star. All right, so real quick, here are the sources that I use for this. So Pro Basketball Encyclopedia has a lot on Jack Porter and other folks as well. And then library, newspaper, resources. One thing that's nice is a lot of these older papers are now digitized and you can look them up online. I know the Hudson Library has old copies of some of the Hudson newspapers. And I know one in particular had references to Jack Porter going back to like 1895. So they're playing out here quite a while ago. And that's basically almost as old as basketball is. So it was invented in 1891, and just a few years later, it's being played all over the place.
And did the Hudson newspapers have articles about Lou too?
So he would appear in them. So very early on, maybe because basketball is a new sport, you'd see blurbs. So there'd be a blurb, kind of like the one we looked at the beginning, where Webster had defeated Hudson like 21-18, and it'd be maybe 2 paragraphs on the game. Then it would be a box score, and the only really statistics that they tracked were field goals and free tries. So in that sense, players' names appeared, and sometimes there'd be some adjectives attached to it, but usually they kept it pretty concise.
Why was there a designated free throw person?
Good question. Maybe because it was so hard to shoot. Because, I mean, that one game we talked about where Porter was 8 for 9, the other team, their designated shooter was like 1 for 7. So if that's their best shooter, imagine how bad everyone else is. So I don't know, but my guess is just that it was difficult to shoot
That's part
with that
of the
warped
rules, that's
ball.
how it was.
Sorry, one more time?
That's part of the rules of the game.
Yes, yeah. So when did that change? I think that changed in the 1910s. Ed Wachter, who I mentioned is in the Hall of Fame, was a proponent of making the people who got fouled shoot their own free throws. But as you know, my best guess is that they just had one shooter because it was hard and you just like picked your best. I don't know. Like in baseball, you have one pitcher at a time, I suppose. Just a guess, though, to be honest.
Did you do something up at the University of Lowell and they finally realized this is part of their history too?
Yes, so in February, part of Black History Month, at a game, they had his granddaughter, and I was part of it too, and we did a kind of Q&A, did a short presentation, they put up a plaque as well, so they did honor him. I guess that would be last February. Channel 5 came out, Richard, you might have referenced that in one of the emails that we had. Yeah. Thanks for having me, and thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.